Does. Oh, but now it is. We are rolling. And I'm here with the beautiful Terrina Picarello, my friend that I've known since I was in my 20s, who is a therapist and a lovely human being. Um, Terrina, I have to start out with a compliment because first of all, I'm not a big fan of the mental health practitioners, and I have my own personal reasons for that. But that doesn't mean that they're all bad. But you're like the opposite extreme. Like you're like the dream therapist because not only do you care, you have an absolutely huge heart, and I'm sure a lot of them do, but you also are constantly studying. Like there's no end to the amount of time that you spend studying, including you actually watch the show and you're listening to the survivors, you're interacting with the chat. And I want to thank you for just being there because it's so wonderful for me to know that if I need anything, I can come to you. And so I'm not even going to take credit for this idea because this was yours. You had it on your heart. You sent me a really long text message, probably the longest one you've ever sent me, explaining why you wanted to do this episode. So why don't you share with everyone, just from your heart, what you were thinking when you sent me that text message?
Well, it's so important to have an agreement or a set of boundaries, like on both sides of what is the best way to share if you're a survivor, and where, how, and where, and when. And so just to, offer what I have to offer to the community, because I think it's so important that we all help each other. And that's what I love about your show and all the people that, you have on, but also the people that follow you. It's a community.
Mhm.
So if you're a part of the community, you're going to offer what you have to help the community be bigger and better than it is. And this is just my thing. And so I just wanted to have everybody have a shared reference point for what is a therapeutic share, especially if we're specifically talking about survivors. As a therapist, I would, in my field, know that, well, there's several kinds of survivors. So which kind of survivor are we talking about? So there's some programs that, treatment centers have or private practices have called Survivors Week or Survivors Workshop. And those are in general for people who have just remembered like childhood sexual abuse or domestic violence then or now or both. And so it's anybody who has been victimized and needs to start recovering. And so they call it Survivors Week. And so we want you to survive. We don't want you to stay in that victim mode, right? And we want it to be therapeutic. So as people were talking about survivors, I just want all of us to know there's what kinds of survivors, right? So you could be a survivor of incest. You could be a survivor of sexual abuse by any number of different kinds of people in your life. And usually it's someone that's an intimate. It's somebody that's close to you that usually is able to have access to children to abuse. You could have religious abuse. It could be religious abuse that also includes sexual abuse and religious abuse. Religious abuse is particularly something that a lot of people just don't have an awareness of. And it's really particularly damaging. And you would want to, if you do want to find a therapist to help you with it, you would want a therapist that has some experience and some training in it. Where I learned how to be a therapist and where I was an intern and where I was the apprentice for a long time, 2 years before I could get my license and be, independently licensed. I had really good teachers. I had really master therapist teachers, and what they particularly specialized in and were known for, so that was kind of like the bigger part of their population, was for treating pastors and their families who had any number of things going on, because the founder of our practice was also an ordained minister. And so he was a pastor first. And as a pastor has some kind of, pastoral counseling training to try to help when people in your church come to you for help, you learn some skills when you're, being taught to be a pastor. But what he did is he found that he just felt like he was still kind of inadequate. And so he thought he was just going to continue to be a pastor. And he went and got a PhD in marriage and family therapist just to be a more helpful therapist, pastor. And so once he saw the difference between what pastors do as a pastoral counselor and what a license, he saw the difference. He just didn't know. And that's the thing. Sometimes you don't know what you don't know, but sharing information is helpful. So part of what I'm doing today is filling in gaps from, in the community for what I do know. And I really thank him quite a bit for being a place where people could go for help with religious abuse, because what happens is there's such a stigma when we talk about you were abused by a church. It's like this thing that we still need to add to the list of what we can now talk about. We didn't used to talk so comfortably about addiction, even, when you and I were little kids, people would whisper it, if
Right.
at all. And people just didn't have information about it. They didn't know that, there was any treatment, and misinformation was there was a lot of shame. So the reason that people didn't talk about drug abuse and drug addiction is shame. They felt like it was a moral failure. And so they don't want to talk about it, and families were ashamed. And so when you talk about something that happens in your church and you talk about abuse that happens in a church, and it could include sexual abuse or not, or if you talk about a pastor that has addiction in their family, whether it's them or their spouse or their children, there's so much shame that people weren't going to get help. So then that hurts the whole church, right? And so he and some other people who were also ministers and licensed therapists, they got together and just started to just be a place that was safe for pastors and their families to go get help. And so then they saw that there was even more widespread issues that needed, to be addressed. So, I had a good teacher, and now that I think when your community is talking about survivors, it's survivors of, ritual abuse. A lot of it is from the church, or a lot of it is under cover of church. Mm-hmm. So I just want everyone, we all know this, but just to remember that what you're doing here and what anybody that, is trying to help the community be more safe and therapeutic and just safe. It's important that you have, maybe we all have a common boundary and we all have a common understanding of how to hold a healthy space and how to just hold the boundaries of what is appropriate to share on a format like this, mm-hmm. and what isn't, and what's safe.
Because there's some very, very real dangers, and there's tends to be a boomerang effect that people don't expect, and then there's, like we had talked with Madison before, there's just the emotional release, but it also, is very trying on the body. And so what we're really wanting to focus in on the most today, though, is the piece about, are you ready to share publicly or privately? And are you ready to, what's the word for it? Are you ready to handle the possible pushbacks?
Right.
I'll be right back while you.
Okay. And do you even know what that pushback is? Because if you don't get a heads up of what to expect once you share, you definitely shouldn't share yet. So that's what Carmen and I really wanted to provide for everybody, some kind of a reference point that we can all hold in common. And so there are stages to the recovery process. There's like stages of, you start here and then you have you progress along stages to get to healing. And so when we talk about survivors, it means I've survived being victimized, and I've survived being damaged and wounded and hurt. So we don't want to share before we're have a foundation that's solid in our being healed, right? You don't want to share at the beginning before you have enough healing to share. And there's sharing is a part of your healing. And that's where I feel like there's a little confusion, because the being able to share the story just so you can hear it yourself is a part of the healing process. But there's a time and a place along each stage, and you need to know kind of where you're at in those stages on how to appropriately share. And it's good for us as a community of people that we care about, our friends and families. How do we know as a listener when someone wants to share their story with us? Just, you know, as a friend, I want to tell you what I'm just aware of, or I want to tell you what happened to me. Is this group can help spread the word of holding a safe place and how to do that, right? And so you want to be good at when do you share certain things with people, and then when you are the listener, how do you help that go well on that side too? So there's really a job and there's some responsibilities that go on both sides, whether you're listening or whether you're sharing. And so the first part of sharing is when you're just starting to like pull the experience from your unconscious regressed database into consciousness. And that's a pretty big experience, and part of having someone, you know, witness you. That's what fellowship is. Having someone bear witness really helps it be true. You know, if someone else saw it or someone else sees it, it's kind of more real. So it's helpful, but that isn't something, that's not a stage that you're ready to share on a format like this. And you have to be very methodical in who you share what with. So there's levels of intimacy that you want to be mindful of. And if anyone's not aware, just a lot of people that watch your show, and you two are aware that when you're sharing and someone's hearing it, they can get triggered. So people that are listening, and on a format like this, anyone could be listening, right? So we want to all be responsible that they could get triggered, and it could trigger memories and traumatic memories inside of that person. And so we would want to be mindful that the people listening, are they in a safe, stable, supported place to get triggered and have a bunch of stuff come out, right? So I always get a little worried about sharing on a format like this, because we don't know who's alone by themselves watching this. And all of a sudden, if all of this stuff comes up and they're by themselves, or they don't have the support, or they're not in a place in their life where it's, you know, safe to handle that, that wouldn't be great, right? We all get through it and God helps us out, but there's just good, better, and best ways to do this. So if we share, we want to make sure that the person listening to our share is stable and able to hear that share. Because if we're talking about SRA, it's very difficult material. It's not for little girls and boys, it's for big boys and big girls that can handle holding space for that kind of content. And I would just want everyone to know that a lot of people can't handle it. Now we need to all get ready to handle it. We need to stretch ourselves. But what does that mean? So we have to be mindful to let everybody on both sides pace themselves. So if you start to share and someone is struggling, then you just pause and then you wait, but you at least pay attention to, can the person handle sharing this? And is it a safe person to share with? And so what you would want to do is have those, before you share something like a survivor story, you have to have already survived it, right? So you can't be in the middle of your healing. And one thing that I really recommend,
and that's one thing that a lot of them try to rush that, I think. And I think sometimes it's because their friends or their family members or somebody thinks, oh my God, you've got to get this information out there, which I get. I understand why, you know, there's children's lives at stake, you know, sometimes because the perpetrator's still out there. But to make sure that they're ready, and I kind of learned that lesson the hard way, having people on that that weren't healed, and you could tell by the way that they responded and the things that they wanted, rather than really and truly just sharing.
Right. So I want to hold up and start having a common definition of therapeutic sharing. What is the intention of your sharing? Why are we sharing? So if you're sharing as a part of your recovery and your healing, that's one kind of sharing. I'm sharing because I need to start talking about this so that I can understand and integrate more what happened to me, and I can start to heal from this. There's that sharing. And from friend to friend and friend to family member, your close circle, that would be what you're doing. You're sharing because you're trying to start your healing process. And having a witness and having someone support you emotionally while you heal is a very helpful part of it. It helps you keep going to the next stage. But if you're talking about, I want to share my story because there's a crime that's been committed, and I want to share my story because I've got to alert people about what's happening, that is completely different.
Yeah.
And so what you have to be mindful of is, which one are you doing? And I'm trained as an EMDR therapist, which is sort of like an advanced kind of trauma therapy. And as part of my training as an EMDR therapist, we are taught to first do a full history and ascertain whether, and discern whether this person is likely to report this as a crime, and is there likely going to be a court case? Because you don't share before a decision is made about that. And you don't start kind of continuing to heal, which sounds kind of weird when you're a therapist, but you have to be responsible, because that is a part of this this subject matter. Is there are bad guys out there, and I'm speaking for myself. I want them to be held accountable, and I want them to be not able to harm anybody else. So
Right.
if you want to make sure that we protect the criminal process so somebody can be prosecuted, you don't just start sharing. And so when you share, if you want to do a parallel process where you want to do both, you want to start healing and share, but you also want to protect the ability for the police and the prosecutors to put a good case together. You don't want to jeopardize the criminal process. Then you don't give details in your sharing. You don't give specifics. You share in generalities. And especially if you do it on a format like this, you go super general. You don't give out any identifying information. And you wouldn't want to also be handling a share, a therapeutic share, like it's an interrogation like you see in court. Those are
Right.
two completely different things. And I would want survivors to know that my best guidance for you in taking care of yourself and starting this journey is be really clear inside of yourself of, I'm sharing, and every little bit of detail is evidence. And if you have someone that you're sharing with that's sort of asking for every detail and asking for proof and asking for evidence and asking you to prove it, because we see that dynamic a lot.
Oh,
And
yeah.
if they act as if they don't believe you, and they are skeptical, and they're sort of being defensive, and they're asking you to like prove yourself, you stop talking to that person. That's not a therapeutic share. That's likely to harm both sides. That's somebody that, unless you're talking to a police officer, they shouldn't have that tone with you.
Mm-hmm.
And they shouldn't even come at you with that kind of energy. And I want everyone who has been harmed and is trying to heal, I want to give you permission to just stop that conversation. You don't have to be harsh about it,
Right.
but you just exit the conversation. You just, that's all you need to see is when someone starts going into, well, and it just seems like they want proof, and in any ilk, seem like they don't believe you, and it's hard for them to hear, and this is just hard for them to believe. you stop talking, because it's very harmful for a survivor to talk to anyone that is going to doubt you and try to like it's gaslighting, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, how do you know that happened, and how do you know you remembered it right, and like all of that? You stop talking.
Right. Or it could be like the people that are purposely trying to ruin your case.
Exactly. So if anybody comes at you with that tone, you just, in whatever way fits your personality, you just sort of like end the conversation. And you can do that in any number of ways. And I just call it the broken record technique. Like, well, this is just my experience, and we don't have to talk about that anymore. I don't really want to talk about it anymore. We can talk about it another time, but not for today. Let's just change the subject. And then they say, oh, well, I won't, and they just try to, and you just repeat yourself. Well, it's my story. It's my experience. And
You repeat it.
we don't have to talk about it today. And then
That's
they go,
good.
no, I can talk about it, blah, blah. And you go, well, it's my experience. It's my story. And I'd like to change the subject, and, we can talk about it another day.
And think about it, any normal person, if anyone was to, I could be talking about flowers and they could say, I really just don't like talking about flowers. I would totally honor it, right? I wouldn't be like, why don't you want to talk about flowers? That's weird. I would just assume there's some reason, and I don't want to push them. Yes.
And that's the thing is, if people start getting defensive or pushy, either they're not a safe person to share for any number of reasons, or you might be triggering them. And so that's not right to do that. So you don't want to do any harm, right? Do no harm. So you've already been harmed. You don't want to spread the harm. So please be aware when you share really difficult content about, especially anything that happened when you were a child, and graphic things that kind of go against the rules of nature, right? Things that are just hard for people to believe. You have to be mindful that there's a way that you share those kind of things, just to be responsible. Just like, you drive a big truck different than you drive a little car. It's just like how you do it. So it isn't like there's anything good, bad, or indifferent. It's just how you handle something bigger with a bigger impact. There's a different strategy for how you talk about that. And there is something called vicarious trauma that concerns me as a therapist when I see people sharing, is we wouldn't want to vicariously traumatize more people. Okay. And so when you experience abuse as a child, now you are traumatized. Some people more and less than others, right? And so there's already a risk that your harm could last a long time and cost a lot of money and time to fix. And so we don't want to add to the pile, right? And when you are just sharing without checking if somebody is able to hear it, you can vicariously traumatize them. Because just like in a home where there's domestic violence, if you see your mother being beaten by your dad, or your dad being beaten by your mother, anything like that, or your one parent is beating one child and they don't beat the other children, you're still going to be harmed by witnessing that. So what we need to realize is that I want to encourage people not to give details of their abuse, even when they are strong enough to share, because you could vicariously traumatize people listening.
Yeah.
So you need to give enough information for someone to get the essence of what happened, and enough to know the level of what happened, but you don't relive it and you don't describe it in such graphic detail that the person could feel that they were there. That is not how you share stories like this. You don't share it in a way that you're reliving it and that the other person would know every little detail of what happened, because not only is that re-traumatizing for the person who's sharing. So even when you go to a therapist, and if nobody's been to a therapist and done trauma work, you might not know this, but in trauma therapy, we don't even do that. So if someone comes in for me to work with them, I don't have them relive what happened to them in my office. That is not
Right,
how
of
we.
course.
And so it's not necessary for me as a therapist to know every little detail of what happened. It just isn't. So it isn't necessary for you to share every little detail of what happened so that other people get a sense of what happened to you. So don't
Right.
do that. And if someone is telling you and they go into a story and they start telling you every detail, you just gently redirect them. And you say, well, I don't want you to relive it, but I just need to get, I do want you to share with me, but I just need to get a sense. I don't need to know every detail.
It's good.
And you don't need to know every detail. And the other thing is that if you share a lot of detail on a format that, such as this, where it's being recorded or anyone's recording it, it can harm a case because you're not sharing in a way that you would be guided with counsel if it's a criminal case. There's a certain thing you say, certain thing you don't, and there's just a certain like parameters for a legal case. And you wouldn't want to just share and then they can use those sharings to undermine your story in court.
Right.
Right? So there's legal sharing, and that's where you would need to provide evidence. But in your personal life and out in the community, no one should even ask you or pressure you to like prove it. Well, what's your evidence? Well, how do you know that? That isn't, you just stop right there. Okay, because that's a receiver that isn't able to receive. It's just an inappropriate share right there.
Why
So
why why do people do that? Because it does seem to be a very, very common reaction.
well, in general,
Because I
they
think it's good
either
for the victims to know that this is something they could face and why they face it.
it's not only likely that you'll face it. So it's just a matter of time. I just haven't had anybody tell me that they didn't experience that. So you
Wow.
have to be ready for people to not believe you. And then how do you handle that if they don't believe you? And so you want to have some support and some information about how to hold your ground and be assertive and practice it with people that are your good friends. And so I would say that unless somebody is well experienced and they've shared their story with their close friends, with their, partner, if they're married or in a partnered relationship, with people in their community, so that they already can see, because it just comes up. And so they have some way to even answer if they are able to handle that. And in general, just at a basic human being level, we don't want to believe those things have ever happened. We don't want to live in a world where children experienced something horrific as any number of things, right? So sometimes if people just aren't able to contain that bad things happen in the world and that bad things do happen, they just don't have a lot of experience sitting with that, they're just kind of not on the list of who you share this kind of content with. So you need someone that has already some chops, so to speak, of handling difficult content, whatever it is in the world, that they are somebody that you know well enough and you've seen them under stress and they can kind of handle difficult things. And so those are probably people that are better than people that you already know as a friend. They can hardly handle anything. And they just get real,
Yeah.
discombobulated when you share just kind of normal things that aren't great. They
Like
they
I'll
just
be late or can't make it to your
yeah,
party.
yeah, those are
Oh,
definitely people that they're not going to be people you share with. And then it doesn't mean that you don't keep them as a friend. And so
right.
it wouldn't be true that, well, if I can't share this with you, then, and you don't know everything about my life, then you can't be my friend. That doesn't end up being true. And so you can have friends that just, you don't share it with them because they actually aren't sort of experienced, or in their own life, that is just isn't something that they're ready to handle. Now they might in 5 years, but you don't need everybody to know this about you to have them as a friend. And so that's a part of learning sort of the degrees of intimacy that you share with people. You have some people you share everything. You have the next level that you share most, but not everything. And then you have another layer of usually like acquaintances, friends and family, community that you don't really share intimate, deep stuff with them
Right.
because they don't need to know. So these types of stories that are deeply effective and powerful, you share those with people who've earned their way into the circle of I call it the circles of intimacy. And so an inside circle person has to earn their way to that, to the right to hear your story. And you audition them. You tell them little things and you see how they handle it.
That's good.
And you see if they hold a confidence. Because if you share a story of abuse or anything, that happened to you as a child or some intimate personal thing, that is not now their story to tell. So this is something that is, you just shared it with them, and they are not supposed to repeat it when they get home and tell their family and that isn't now their story to tell. So you need to practice, people, before you share something that's this powerful, because it can harm people. This is such a powerful experience that is not mainstream, and it's not for everyone. So people who are welcomed into this part of your life or into this community, they have to earn their way in. It's not for everyone, and everyone shouldn't be involved in it, right? And you have to kind of have a vetting process for who gets to be intimate with you and who gets to hear, and when you're ready, and also if the people are ready. And so people have to earn their way into the right to know. And if somebody can't hold a confidence, if somebody starts trying to kind of take your story over, right? Like, especially when you've been a trauma victim, you are the boss of your story. You are the boss of your story. And it's very important for your recovery for you to stay the boss of your story. You don't let anybody rush you. You don't let anybody tell you what you need to do to heal, because how do they know what you need to do to heal? And so as a survivor, you want to kind of get yourself prepared for your little broken records, right? People want to help, but you need to stay in charge of it, or it can kind of destabilize you. And so the thing that happened when you were victimized is you weren't in control of it. So the antidote is for you to stay in control of it. So as a trauma therapist, I go at someone's pace. I don't direct it. I don't go faster than they can go, and I don't go slower than they can go, but I have to continue to check in to see what their pace is. And so what you want to do the whole time before you start sharing, and what I do as a therapist, is before I even do trauma work with somebody, I have to make sure that they're safe. So the first pillar and foundation is the person that's sharing safe? So are they living in a safe place where they can lock the doors and sleep safely? Do they live in a place where, somebody is violent? Like, it could even be their child. They have a violent child that's kind of like unpredictable. Or they live with a partner that, rages or, is unstable.
Has PTSD or something. Yeah.
Exactly. And so that is like, that won't work. Those two things don't go together. So we have to like problem solve some of these things before I'll even be able to do trauma work with people. And so I would say the same framework for if you share, right? Because if you're not safe, it can really destabilize you physiologically. It can hurt you more biologically, because trauma is physiological. We can see it on a brain scan. We can see PTSD on a brain scan. And so you don't want to do further damage to your brain or your nervous system, because we all only have a certain amount of bandwidth. You know, we have a certain amount of electrical current, we have a certain amount of biological energy every day, and we don't get more. And so trauma work is going to be a big electrical experience and a big physical experience, because we're going to reset your whole electrical system. We're going to reset it. And so you have to have the bandwidth to do it. So you can't also have 5 other fires that you deal with every day. It's just, it doesn't work. So safety first. Is the person safe? Do they have a safe place to live? Is there the way that they support themselves safe? Because if you're going to start sharing your story and someone that is in charge of your finances, or even just your employer, if your employer is going to have a problem with that, or somehow they feel unsafe, or they feel that somehow it destabilizes a team, or just they can't handle that content, well, then that isn't safe to share in a way that gets back to your coworkers and your employer, right? So you have to vet that a little bit, because you wouldn't want you coming out with your story to affect your ability to support yourself financially, right? And if people that are in charge of your money and your support would have a problem and try to hold that over you, and try to say, well, I'm the one that supports you, so I'll tell you who you're going to tell and when you're going to tell it. Sometimes parents do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And that is not workable. That's not in the handbook for how to do it. That's how you don't do it. So you have to make sure that you're in a place, you know, if you're an adult, that your money is your own, and that even if people get mad at you, and even if people don't support you, and if, especially if it is, if you're going to report somebody that is a high profile person or in a church, people will feel like you're threatening something that's important to them, and they will just want to shut you down. And so you have to make sure that any losses that you would have don't destabilize you. So you have to like
Exactly.
really put a lot of thought into safety, and then security. Your security is food, clothing, and shelter. And so would any of that be at stake? Would you have to move because somebody's mad at you, or you'd have to, you know, if your church is a main source of comfort, then maybe you share in a way that you keep your confidentiality. You're sharing in places where you can start sharing so that you can start healing, but your community doesn't hear your story if you don't feel like they're mature enough to handle it, right? Or if they're going to protect you. You want to share in a way that you have some way to know how people are going to react. And if you don't, then you just share with a therapist. And a lot of times a therapist will have a group that they put together, and the therapist vets everybody that joins that group. So you have to like have interviews with the therapist, and they have to make sure that you are stable enough to be in the group, that you are vetted to make sure that you won't break anybody's confidentiality, and the therapists lead the group to make sure that the shares are appropriate, that someone doesn't give too many details, that somebody doesn't give identifying information. And so therapists make sure that it's safe and appropriate. And even in a therapeutic group, you don't give last names, and you don't give details, and you don't start hanging out after group. It's a therapeutic group just so you can say what happened, you can hear other people, but those are structured in a way very specifically for things that have gone wrong. So there's always a reason for some of these recommendations, right? From experience. And so
For sure.
So then the next thing is stability. Is if you're sharing this story would threaten your stability or someone else's. So if you don't know enough about somebody to know how they would emotionally, physically, mentally, and spiritually handle hearing this, if they've never heard of this stuff before, and they don't know you don't want to take somebody 0 to 60, right? On anything. You have to kind of go slow and see how important people respond to just tolerating that bad things happen, and that it could be somebody that they respect that has harmed a child, any child. But if it's someone that knows you, they're going to be even more upset,
Right.
because for the person hearing it, they're going to, they're going to be split, because it's a loss on both sides. And so these are things that it's part of your responsibility as a survivor. This is under your domain to be responsible for these things. You stay the boss of your story. You stay the boss of your recovery. And this is a part of the responsibility of managing your recovery well, is getting information, talking to people who know, and feeling like you know what you're doing before you take a step like that. What do I need to know? How do I need to be prepared? How do I know that the person I'm sharing with is appropriate and knows how to keep me on track and has the same boundaries? And then how do I make that decision? And unless you feel like you have a good sense of it, just like you would study anything else, then you don't do stuff like this, because the consequences of just, making, innocent mistakes could be big.
Right.
And so, there's some prep, quite a bit of prep that goes into this, because, and again, you're the boss of your story. So you don't let people tell you, you should, speak here, you should tell this person, because what I want us to think about as a community is the sharing about the victim, the person who is victimized. There's a way you listen and there's a way you support, because it's just about them. Here's what happened to a real person, and how are you doing with that, and what have you experienced, and how are you healing, and how are you continuing to heal, and where are you at in the process. And it's about that person. So we are listening to support that person. It's not about the person that did it to him. Now, if you want to talk about the person that hurt them, that is a completely different thing that you're doing now. So we all need to decide, what thing are we doing? And that's why you don't really, you way down the road, you can maybe mention names if it has a benefit, and if you've already decided whether you're going to pursue legal or not pursue legal. And if it makes sense that you share names, you do. But in general, sometimes that's a big mistake that people make, because it changes the subject, right? And then the people listening get all off track, and then they're focused on the perpetrator or the bad guy, and nobody's there supporting the victim, because now people are like off on a completely different tangent. And just think about how hurtful that is for a victim, because now all of a sudden you need support, and you need to kind of like understand what happened by having somebody sit with you and follow, like, yep, and then this happened and this, and have somebody like mirror back to you and sit with you and witness. And then all of a sudden they just change the subject and start asking all these questions about the person that was the perpetrator. It's hurtful. But we need to be mindful as a community, what is our priority, and what is our intention, and what's our focus, because you would be really challenged to do both at the same time. You almost can't do both. You need to pick. And so if our intention is to help survivors heal, there's a time and a place for names and who, what, where, and when. And we have to be responsible around them, and as a community, to make sure that it's first safe, and make sure that they have made a decision whether they're going to pursue criminal or not, because the way that you share is very different. So you can give enough information without jeopardizing your safety and without jeopardizing a criminal case, but you have to kind of be on top of it and be smart about it. And you have to have a strategy, and you have to have a map, and then it can work. But you just don't go all cowboy, with no boundaries and no guidelines. That doesn't work.
Right. And I, but then there's a piece of me that says, how every once in a while, God does appoint somebody to be that person that tells, but it's usually because it's so urgent to the world. You know,
But
something's going to poison people, or, it's
mhm.
legitimately, actively still harming people.
So you can do that with protections in place for the person that's telling the story, because it's important to keep them alive so that they can like continue
Hmm.
to make sure that we're getting the right thing done and we know what we're trying to, protect people from, right?
Sure.
And also, if we're going to do a criminal case, and just for the sake of history, we need to get this right and protect all the pieces. So we need to protect the person who's the witness. And so the way
Right.
you do that a lot of times is you can not use last names, and sometimes you change the first name, and you just let people know that you're using an alias to protect the whole thing, to protect the witness. And that is just a legitimately wonderful thing to do. And
Hmm.
sometimes it makes a lot of sense, and it makes the whole thing stronger when you have someone share under an alias, or maybe just first name only. In all of the support groups that
Yeah.
any reputable therapist does, we don't let people use last names, and we don't want them to share any kind of identifying, like where you go to school or where you work, or we don't give names and specifics. But if it's something, where we're going to, pursue, sharing with the community to try to keep people safe, then it makes a lot of sense to, you know, use an alias, because if the point is we need people to know, but we
Right.
don't, we need to protect the witness, that's how you do that.
Right. No, that's good because that's what Jesse started out with. Jesse was just a voice at first and a different name. And then she became a voice and a picture. And then she became a voice and a picture in her real
That is
self.
how you do it. That's how you do it, because you have to, again, as a person sharing something that's difficult, you want to be as responsible as you can for it to go well. Because if you want a lot of people to know, there's a better way to do that so it doesn't all
Great
fall
point.
apart.
So good.
So there's a good track record that we have to look back on what works. And so we can look at Jesse's story and say, well, that was pretty smart and that worked. And we learn from mistakes, right? As a community, we learn from experience, and individually, we learn from experience. So you want to really listen to people who have some experience in the same, thing that you're
So
doing.
true.
Is don't try to reinvent the wheel, especially while you're trying to do something with quite a bit of complexity and quite a bit of danger. And when you're talking about something like trauma, it can harm the person who's sharing if there's not some boundaries and a framework around the sharing, and it can harm the people listening. Not to mention, the person speaking can be attacked for speaking.
Hmm.
And so there's some good um, experienced people who've done it before, and there's a community of people that work in that they can tell you do's and don'ts. And so you want to make yourself aware and take the
Yeah.
time to kind of research that and say, okay, what's what do what do people who have more experience in this do and not do. So you want to do things in consultation with wise counsel.
Absolutely. Well, and it's interesting too, because even Cheryl Beck's experience, if I'm remembering correctly, she's gotten to the point where, she really does um she she'll be telling me something even privately, and I'll be like, "Oh, I'm so sorry." And she goes, "Oh gosh, no. I'm so healed from this. Like I am over." However, the church that she went to wasn't ready for her story, and it
Yeah.
wasn't even the church that was affected by it. It just was later in life. And it is interesting how there can be pushback even many, many years later.
And this is just because collectively we have a hard time with this content. And in general, most people will poo-poo and just try to shut you down if you talk about child abuse or child sexual abuse or any of that still today. And we've been trying to talk about it for
It's
40
gotten
years.
better. It has
It's gotten
better.
better.
Yeah.
But it's still not an average experience that people can hear that. So we're still way behind on that. So you're going to skip to even more graphically horrific things that have happened to humans without a warm up and without them having an opportunity to build a tolerance for it. It's just not kind and it doesn't work. So we have to be mindful that you have to create some foundations and give people an opportunity to support themselves enough to hear it. And so sometimes the people that need to know this, there's some prep work and there's some things that need to happen so that they can hear it. And you just, again, you have to be responsible about it and do what works without just, guessing and hoping for the best. We have a lot of people who've been doing this for a while. So there are people that know how to guide you. And since it is so important that we spread the word and start shutting this stuff down, it's more important than ever that we do it right.
Yes.
Because we don't really have a whole lot of time to keep screwing around with this stuff, right? And there is a decent database of expertise in this area. So we want to do our due diligence just like we do anything else that we want to do well. We need to learn how to do it a little bit and learn from others and then be really responsible and, follow what works and not just guess and not get ahead of it.
Well, it's wild too because the thing that shocked me, and I've been blessed because I've been following, Jesse for so long, and I've been an avid reader my whole life, so I've heard a lot of stories. And what was so beautiful about the way that Jessie did it, and she did it purposefully, is she did do it right. She didn't come out with all this crazy stuff first. She first set the stage for it. And I think this is one of the most brilliant things that you're saying today is a message sent correctly and more carefully is going to affect more widespread. Here's where I think that there's one of the biggest things that surprised me though was I could not believe the level of infiltration in the places that are supposed to be safe. The police or the church or the therapist or whoever, and they're all kind of a part of it. And I think that that's where it gets into that tangled, clustery, like you said, complex.
But now that we know that,
right,
we all have to be responsible. We have to do it right. We have to know because we want to listen to people that have gone ahead of us. They're telling us good information. So believe them. Let's believe them that you have to be very careful when you share to police. People wouldn't think that, but we know that now. So every police officer isn't going to be safe to share. Some are, but you have to do your discernment on what kind of police officer do you share with? How do you know if it's going well? When do you stop talking? What do you look for that says that police officer is not safe? You need some help and coaching before you just go out and try something like that. And I would say that you assume that
that's good.
Not going to go well and you work back from there. You assume that the person isn't going to handle it well or isn't safe because mostly you're mostly going to be sharing with untrained, unsafe people.
Yep.
And until you vet them and have some data on them, don't think that they're safe and don't think that they're an okay person to share with. You have to be very, very picky about who, when, and where you share.
It's true,
It
because
could
you
put,
can report a crime but not give details. They can ask, but you're not forced to answer those questions.
that's right. You give a little bit and then you get some feedback for how they respond. And that tells you if you go any further. And you want to have some support. You want to have somebody that goes with you. You want to have a backup. You want to have a witness. You don't want to talk to anybody in a position of authority without a buddy. You don't want to give a police report without a witness. And I do a lot of that. I will go as a licensed therapist with a person to go and do a police report. And I would say the truth is 70% of the time, it doesn't go well, it isn't safe enough, and we get up and leave. And 30% of the time,
Wow.
yes,
Wow.
it
Okay,
is
so
so
that's
bad,
not even that's not even you
so
going,
bad.
hold on a second, let's not ask that way or let's not talk that way. It's not even just you interrupting, it's you saying we need to leave.
It means, yep, we're walking. And I prep the person before, and that's why I'm going. And then I will vet whoever interviews. I'll say, listen, I'm a therapist. I'm coming with them. I want somebody who is trained in forensic interviewing. I want somebody who's trained to interview a crime victim or a rape victim. I want somebody who's certified, trained. I'm not going to just tell this to anybody. So I'm going to get out and walk out if the person doesn't know what they're doing. And so I do all that prep before. And then there's supposed to
Beautiful.
be all these organizations, in the Phoenix area, we have certain ones. In every area, there's certain ones that are like, they have the reputation and they're supposed to have the training. And, I'm not going to mention the name brand of the one here that is supposed to be the place to go. And that's all they do. And it's all they're known for. It's a nonprofit, and they're supposed to be set up to make sure that, you go there and the police officers come there so that it's like not the police station, and it's like all this money and all this effort goes into creating a safe place for victims to report a crime. And I've had bad experiences there and gotten up and left. So it's infiltration, right? And it's of course they're going to try to have some dark players in the
Well, and
good
it would
places.
be free, right? Oh, so we take away that objection. It would be the best and specializing, which takes away all of the other possibilities. And so you can almost just see that the bad guys have just put a little tee there for your golf ball, so they can just whack it out of there. And so
But
this is
but you
really, really important information, Trina.
but I couldn't have been more shocked. I was really, really disturbed, and it was a while before I recovered. It took me a while to bounce from just the shock of that being true, because that's like, well, that is supposed to be the safe place. So if the safe place isn't safe, what does that mean? And we all have to be forgiving and give a lot of grace to everybody who's trying.
Yes.
And if it doesn't go well the first time, you just regroup and you just go and try again. It doesn't mean that you don't share. It means you stop sharing with that person and then you start over and you do the process again. And then if the next person isn't safe, then you just go on to the third person. You have to continue to stay with it. And so you will have people in your life that don't respond well when you try to share with them. And then that's okay. You want to give them a couple of more chances, because sometimes people are shocked and they don't respond how they really feel. They have a shock response, and you got to let them take a minute to regroup, and then maybe 2 or 3 days later or the next week you try again. And a lot of people can kind of warm up to it and get ready, and but don't do like a one and done, and don't do don't give up, but also don't not protect yourself. You have to protect yourself. And you also have to be ready that there's going to be people that are your friends and family that can't hear it and won't ever be able to hear it. And from all my years of experience, I will tell you that it works. It's okay. Because a lot of people just go, well, then I have to cut them out of my life. Well, if the person is abusive and they're going to use what you shared against you, and they're gonna exploit it and all of that, then yeah, you can't be around them. But a lot of people aren't going to do that, but they can't handle it, and we have to let that be okay, because they are the only one that knows what they can do and not do. And we don't want to discard people because they,
for sure,
just like anything else that people can't do. You don't want to just only have friends that can serve you. You want to be okay with people that just don't have something to give in some area. And
you know what I was sitting here thinking while you were talking, you literally, there's no time, if something has happened, you reported it to the police, there's nothing that says that you have to do it by this certain day. I mean, unless it's like years later, right? There's probably some.
There are statutes of limitation on abuse, and they're just ridiculous, and they're set up on purpose so that the bad guys get away with it. And so a lot of states have changed their statute of limitations. There's still people working on all of that. So that is in process. There's tons of people and advocates working on that.
Good.
And so in general, it's kind of long, but it's still, there shouldn't be any statute of limitations. What the people in the, in the field are saying is you can't just create some arbitrary, if you don't remember it by this date, then too late. So we're trying to get all of those just no statute of limitations taken off. But you need to know in your state what the deal is. And then if it's not right, we need to all keep trying to change it, right? So, but you need to look up some stuff and find out in your state. In every state, the definition of child abuse is different. In all of our 50 states, it's different based on where you live. So you need to look up the list. In some states, for a long, long time, the bar was so high that child abuse that anyone would know as child abuse didn't meet the criteria. And so
doesn't surprise me.
You'd be surprised by the things that the authorities are not allowed to follow up on. So there's your own sense of what is legally child abuse might not be what actually is the statute, the criminal statute in your state.
So what is a range of it? Let's say somebody, was a young girl, was, date raped. She was drugged and raped. She tells the police because nobody was with her when she was found or whatever. But she doesn't give details. How long does she have to tell her whole story?
Well, the most common,
or just for your state, I know you don't know all of them.
The most common thing is that once you're aware, once you come to grips with being harmed, that's when the clock starts, because we have a ton of information about trauma now. We have so much science around trauma. And there's been some good people that have gone to court and got this to be, accepted in the courts. And that you can go into an amnesic state after trauma where you're in shock. So you could be in shock for like a year or 2 years. And it's a part of the way that you survive it is to just you push it away, and you can't even talk about it, and you don't really remember anything. And you can also get a head injury when you're assaulted. And so there's a lot of reasons that you couldn't put that together for a while. But once you're aware of it and you could coherently tell the story, that's when the clock starts.
Okay.
And for most states, you have up to, this is so silly to me, but you have like, if you remembered childhood sexual abuse, you have until age 35. Somebody just randomly decided that if you don't remember it by 35, then you can't pursue criminal charges against somebody that harmed you as a child. So, that would be involved with, priests. A lot of that came out with the cases against the priests, where people often don't remember it until way later. And then they went to report it as a crime and try to get that. Of course, that priest is probably still in the parish, and then they found out that that was the statute. So there's been lots of fights and lots of wins against things like that. But in general, it's about a year. Like, if you were
From the
assaulted
time you report it.
Mhm. And then you want to have professional support to help you present your story and why you didn't come forward.
Right.
But you do that in the right way, because there's a lot of bad interviewers at the police station, and they can undermine the whole thing. And I have seen people completely newly traumatized by the court process. And that is quite common. And so whenever I work with somebody, it's like there's certain things that I'm a mandatory reporter. So there's certain things that if someone says this, I have to at least make a police report.
Right.
But for a person that's been the victim, you have to really research in your area if it's safe to share and what the situation is based on who, what, where, when. And you have to really think about it for a while, because the process right now of reporting crimes often causes a lot more harm, and you just have to expect it. I mean, really, it's you're going to be further harmed and traumatized by the criminal process. And so that's why I go with people to try to mitigate that and try to reduce the amount. But there's always some. And when you have support, it affects you less. When you have a witness and you have somebody there protecting you, you get hurt, but it isn't as deep, and it's easier to fix and quicker. But I prep people for it, and I say, okay, now I want you to
Which
imagine this
which
happen.
which brings me to another question. So you prep them. Do you ever suggest that they shouldn't? Because I'm sitting here thinking that in some cases there might be so much damage and it might take so long. And the only reason I think of this is I think about there's so many women that spend like decades, it seems sometimes, going after men for money for their children or whatever. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, you could take that same amount of energy and put it towards something positive. I guess there's so many extenuating, like you said, it's so complex,
But
but
that's
I was
why you
just
have to really,
wondering.
that's why you think about it, because you say, okay, based on what happened and based on the evidence that we have and based on what we could show. And a lot of times what I do is I have a couple of police officers in town that I will have them come sit with us, and we'll run through the case and say, here's, and they will give us their best professional opinion of, and a criminal attorney could do the same thing. I have a couple of attorneys that also do this for me. And so we'll say, like, here's the situation. How strong is the case? So that we can try to decide, is it worth it for the person? Because if you're going to go through the process criminally, you're going to get really beat up and harmed, and it's really grueling, and it's treacherous. So it's a big deal on the victim to do that. And if if it is a high likelihood that the person gets put in jail, then you might do it and it's worth it, right? But if you're going to go through all of that, and the legal parameters of it are very slim likelihood that there's a prosecution, and every area of the country is different, because there's just certain, like, in different areas there's statistics on how likely this actually gets to court? How likely is it that there's a conviction if it gets to court? And there's a whole bunch of data on that. So you can look at that to try to help you make that decision. And a lot of it is who's in your area, you know, the prosecutor, the district attorney in your area can either take the case or not take the case.
Right.
And so you have to kind of like learn what goes on in your area, and you make those decisions, because at the end of the day, your health and your surviving is the first priority.
Yeah.
And so we don't want to try to think that the court system and the legal system is going to fix anybody. They're not going to fix a crime victim. That isn't where that gets fixed. That's therapeutic. That's outside of that. A prosecution isn't going to fix your trauma. The good trauma therapy and other things, love and attention and the recovering, fixes you, and that gets you to survivor. So your ability to recover doesn't depend on the bad guy going to jail. It just doesn't, because most of the time that's not
For
even part
sure.
of it.
And really, like a lot of times it's more for the other people, because I know for a fact Maria Farmer wouldn't have gone through everything that she went through. It was for the younger girls that she did it.
And there was also, you look at the climate, there's a time when you have better chance of something like that really being honored, listened to, and that there's there's a time when things like that have a better opportunity to go forward, and some of that is God's timing. And so you want to participate when you feel that it is all lining up for you to do that. Then you want to get yourself ready to do that, because it's so important to handle that properly as a community and have that stuff come out and have those prosecutions. And we can't give up when we don't get that. So it's like a parallel process, right? Yes, you pursue it, and yes, you name names, and you don't always. Sometimes you get some small wins and you shore up the troops for the next win.
Yes.
Because we have to have people survive, and we have to have people thriving and being strong, and then we take on the enemy another day. So you have to know where you're at in the continuum of that, and you want to make those decisions with God and with guidance, divine timing and divine guidance of which part should I play right now, because all the parts eventually are connected, right? We're all connected. So you don't want to feel like the way that you did it is right or wrong, and that there's definitely not a one size fits all, because every case is different, every person is different, everybody's situation for their support and security and stability is different. So it might be that like right now they just can't, but in 5 years they can. Mm-hmm. And so like there's really not a simple cookie cutter framework, and it's complex, but at the same time it's not impossible to do this well, and it's not impossible to have some maps that we all pass around and share, and make sure that we share good information about what works where and how we should hear them and how we should support survivors, kind of the do's and don'ts of that, and also how people share, and just to create that structure and guidance around both sides of it, right?
It's so good. I love that you're sharing this stuff. Like, I think it's really, really important. And it just makes me rewind and think of all the mistakes that I've made along the way. And then too, like part of me just gets so flippin' mad that there are people who will take a victim and victimize them.
Yeah, that is gonna happen.
Oh, and it makes me so mad. Like, but
that's about when someone hasn't come to terms and made peace with the fact that this happens in the world, and when you can't sit with your own pain where you have been harmed, then you're gonna do that. So what that's about is not being comfortable with the fact that bad things happen, and that because if you acknowledge that something really bad happened to someone else, then it would be true that something really bad could happen to you. Okay? So if you slow it down, what's under that is that we all like to feel like we are in control of our environment. And we like to have the fantasy that we can keep ourselves safe in any situation, that it would be impossible for somebody to take advantage of us. It would be
We like
impossible
to
for
play
us.
God.
It would
We
just
do.
be impossible. So when we hear a story where it's pretty obvious that there was nothing that this person could do to protect themselves from this, then we can't reconcile that. So we have to attack the whole story. And so that is our own resistance to being vulnerable and having to surrender to whatever God has in store for us. Because everyone sort of, likes that idea in theory, but we really don't want God to give us something that we don't feel like we could handle, right? And so if there's anything in the world that exists that we don't feel like we could survive, we don't want it to exist. So if there's a part of me that says, well, if that ever happened to me, I couldn't survive it. If that ever happened to my child, I couldn't survive it. Then I'm going to just go after those people and say, that couldn't have happened. What are you talking about? That didn't happen. And if that happened and it was so horrible, you wouldn't have survived it and you wouldn't be here to talk about it. So,
Or why'd you wait so long to tell somebody, or, whatever all of the
that's how
crazy
trauma works.
reactions are. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I don't know how you're doing on timing, but there was a little something I wanted
Let's
to
do
tell
it.
you about.
I will wait. This is important enough. And trust me, those boys don't need me to party.
Well, it won't take too long.
I'll make it to the party eventually.
It answers your question about why people sometimes wait a long time to tell, and it helps for people to understand that dynamic. So then we can all learn this and then spread the word, because that's something that people go, well, why didn't you? A lot of times when children report abuse, somebody will say, well, why didn't you just tell them to stop it? Well, why didn't you just get up and leave? Well, because that's not how our survival brain works. When we're in danger and when someone is bigger than us or more powerful than us, and sometimes just older and bigger.
Or your boss. It doesn't even have to be a kid. Yeah.
If your survival depends on that person and you go into that fight, flight, freeze, which is not conscious. Your fight, flight, freeze response just does its own thing without your permission. It either engages or it doesn't. You're not consciously doing that. It's an auto program and it's just on autopilot. So you're not in charge of that. And so the reason that people sometimes can't remember the details and sometimes can't talk about it for a while is because of the fight, flight, freeze. But it's a part of, again, it's supposed to happen. That's supposed to happen. That's a normal response to something that could kill you or harm you. And even if it could kill you emotionally, right? It could harm your ability to psychologically function again if you really let it sit in that it really happened to you, right? So that is how all humans are programmed. So do you want to just look at this real quick?
Yes, please.
Okay, so let me do the screen share thing. So where is the screen share? Share screen?
Should be in the bottom middle.
Okay.
No, this is so good, but I do think it is interesting because I've seen cases, just in the world where, it didn't get taken care of at one point, but God did get them later, I do think that there is a very long arm sometimes of justice.
Thank goodness, right?
Right. Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so this this is Marilyn Murray's work. So this is the Murray method, and this is the method that I do. And so when something happens that is dangerous, so you're going along doing life, and then all of a sudden something happens, then you're going to go into an altered state to deal with that, right? And what happens is now you're kind of not the same mentally, emotionally, or physically before the bad thing happened, right? So you were fine, we have an injury, and then you're kind of not okay for a minute. And so like if you break your leg or you get in a car accident, you're temporarily not okay. And so you go through like the experience of being harmed, and you're not okay until the situation is resolved. But then once you get yourself to the doctor, or you get yourself out of the car and you get everything back to baseline and stabilized, then you go back to being okay, and you're a little bit stronger for having that experience, right? Because when you go through something scary or dangerous or harmful, but you survive it, it's kind of builds your resilience, and then you're more hardy for the next time that something happens. You handle it better, right? So have you ever had an experience, Carmen, where you got hurt and you didn't even notice that you were hurt for a while? Like you didn't feel it?
Emotionally, mentally, spiritually, and
Like
physically,
physical.
yes. All of those.
Okay. So what was an example of something that happened physically and you didn't even notice for a while that you got physically hurt?
Oh, I mean, like working out in the yard and, get a cut, and then you come in to get a drink of water and there's blood on the counter or something.
Yep. And so see how this kind of works? So like in the real world, people don't immediately like notice every little thing that's happening. And so like I remember when I was little, I was about 10, and one of the big kids in the neighborhood, like a high school kid, he got a motorcycle. So every kid in the neighborhood wanted to have a ride around the block on his motorcycle. And so I had never even been on a motorcycle, and then I'm on the back, and then this was kind of a wild kid, so like I didn't really trust him. And so I was scared the whole time around the block. And so I was so paying attention to like not falling off, and like, that I was going to get back without being killed, So when I got off the motorcycle, the whole ride, my leg was on the pipe. So my leg was on that hot exhaust pipe. And when I got off, I had a 2nd-degree burn.
You sure
So
did.
how is it that the whole ride, my leg was being burnt? Something that hot was touching my skin. So you could say, well, how did you not feel that? And how come you didn't scream? And how come you didn't like do something about it? Well, the answer is this is how all of us are wired, is that my brain had to prioritize my safety. And if I fell off or jumped off or kind of freaked out, I could have caused a bigger accident, and we could have both been hurt, or I could have been hurt worse, right? So there are these unconscious survival mechanisms that we all have that are always in play whenever we have anything dangerous happen. And so this is how everybody's nervous system works. And so we go into shock, and shock is a protection so that we can like hold ourselves together until we can be, find out if we're safe or not. And the purpose of shock is supposed to be temporary. And we're supposed to, it's okay to be in shock and to like not notice until you get help, but you're supposed to eventually notice and then take care of your wounds and take care of what happened. That's what kind of normally happens. But what if you're in a situation where you can't get help? What if you're a child, or you're in a situation where nobody will help you and nobody will get you help? Then you can't recover from it, right? So then that thing is just going to drag out because it doesn't ever get handled. most of the time we can handle, we take care of physical injuries, right?
Physical, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And so the same thing happens with emotional shock. So you might not have a mark or a burn, but you're going along doing life and you get an emotional wound. You get an emotional shock or emotional trauma. And so you're temporarily not okay, and you're upset and you don't feel safe and you can't think right. And you're definitely not your grounded self because you're in that kind of like fight, flight, freeze, like, trauma state and not grounded and upset. And so shock will do the same thing, as it comes in to numb us out. And this underlying, feeling sometimes is a little bit too much to take. So shock will come in to temporarily get us out of that crazy, frenetic sort of red line, craziness feeling. So the shock kind of stops that. And that's okay temporarily. So you can try to get yourself stabilized and get some help. But then you're supposed to go back and take care of the problem and take care of what happened. But what most often happens, especially when you are in a disempowered position, like being a kid, you have no power, no influence, it's not under your direction that anything gets fixed, right? And so a lot of times, especially 30 years ago, we didn't really have a lot of science that said that emotional shock is real because we can't see it. So a lot of times, even doctors would just say, well, just don't think about it. Just don't think about it and just, you're fine, you look fine, and just go on with your life, right? And so this is what happens when we have chronic and pervasive trauma. When you talk about the things that we're talking about, SRA kind of trauma, when you don't ever get help over a long period of time, it changes how you are. It changes you from who you were originally. So this is like, we call it the original child. This is your original factory setting from God. So this is like when you're born, this is the person you were created to be. It's the unfragmented child at conception with their innate intelligence, talent, creativity, personality, physical appearance. You have the capacity to feel all your feelings appropriately and inappropriately. So this is sort of an original, healthy, as God created child. And your soul
Can I interrupt you for 1 second? Are
yeah.
you moving those? Because they're not moving. Like I still see just the first slide.
Oh
I'm
no.
not I'm not seeing the ones on the side. I mean, I see them over here just a tiny bit.
Let me see.
There.
So
Yeah.
now you can see it.
Yep.
So are you seeing
I'm
the
seeing the
original
original
child?
child with the brown writing.
Okay. All right. So that's what I just said. Okay. So this is your original factory setting before trauma happens. So let's just think about all these survivors that are sharing. There was an original personality and original temperament and their original strengths. And then when you are exposed to things that children shouldn't be exposed to, and you're exposed to emotional, physical, spiritual abuse, then what happens is your original child is kind of covered up by all of this stuff that happens, and it kind of marks up and covers up your original factory setting. And so you kind of, when someone looks at you, your original self is in there underneath all of that. But we usually don't take care of child abuse in the moment, right? Children
Right.
live years and years and years in abusive situations. And so when you meet that child, you're going to see all of these sort of artifacts of what's really been happening to them. And as they grow up, it's easy for them to believe that that's who they are.
Right.
Because the earlier your abuse happened, the more it's just always there.
Been a
And
part of you. Yeah.
And when you can't get out of the situation, then all of these things build up to cover. And thank goodness it doesn't ever really get rid of your or change your original child, because that's what God created. And so, Satan can't change what God created, thank goodness. And
Yay.
mankind and other people that come along that want to try to like harm you so much that they change you. It's just fascinating to me, of all the cases I work, that it doesn't work. I mean, it's such a wonderful thing to know that what I do as a therapist is I clean all this stuff up, and my job is to get people back to their original factory setting. Right? Could you see the next one?
Yep.
So the next thing that is created is when you have had chronic and pervasive child abuse, a part of your child brain splits off, and you create this part of yourself that holds everything that happened, and holds all the pain, and holds it's your pool of pain, and it holds everything that happened, and it has the trauma, the abuse, the neglect, all your painful feelings, the sadness, the fear, the anger, the loneliness, the helplessness. And it's created, and you have a database that knows all of that, but you can't sometimes show that if the person that's harming you lives in your house.
Right.
Because it's the same thing as telling on someone, right? So a lot of times when you're abused, they make it very clear that you aren't to tell anyone what happened, and you're supposed to just get up the next day and go on with normal life. So when you're in a dangerous situation and you know that you're not supposed to tell, you create, and this isn't that you're doing something wrong. This is what's supposed to happen so that you can recover and survive at some point. You create a part that it's like another part of your personality that knows that bad things happen and did feel all of that. But you have to hide that for your very safety, right? So you create this, but it goes underground and it gets hidden. And the way that you hide it is you create a third part of your personality, and all children have the original components to just do this. This is like the stages of what happens to your personality and how you present when you've been traumatized. So the next little personality that is created is this controlling child. And the controlling child is made out of your original factory setting, your original child, whatever your natural talents you were born with. But the job of the controlling child is to make sure that no one suspects you were harmed, because it puts you in danger. Okay? So there's a part of your personality so that you can survive, so that you're not harmed further, and so that you might live to be an adult that can tell, because those people will hurt you, and they do tell you that if you tell, they'll kill you, or they'll kill somebody that you love, right?
Or they'll beat you, or they'll punish you somehow.
Yeah.
Yep,
Or they
absolutely.
killed an animal in front of you and said, if you tell, or you even have any idea of telling, you'll be next, right? So they make sure that you're pretty clear that you don't tell. So what you have to do, because you actually were harmed and you are hurt, but that shock and that protection comes in, and you just put that all underground. And the controlling child is a part of the survival instinct, and it is your innate defense mechanism. It's created from your original child, which came from God. So it's created from your strengths. And its job is to make sure that the sobbing child and everything they know about what happened is protected in a vault, so that it stays hidden and safe until it's safe for that material to come out. Okay? So it uses repression, anesthetizing agents. Like children sometimes don't have as many options as adults, but adults can drink, they can do all kinds of things that just divert your senses from that. And it's okay that you need some kind of temporary reprieve from that. And later, the positive thing that comes from being able to do that is you're responsible and you have boundaries. And, this is the thing about wanting to share your story. You don't just share your story because you want to share it. You have to make sure you're safe. So your controlling child, the part of you that is responsible and kept you safe when you're a child, is the same part that we need when you're an adult, so that you can control who, what, where, and when you share, so that you keep yourself safe, but you also keep your story safe. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely.
So the controlling child's job is to make sure that nobody knows that you have these gaping wounds and that you have these open, bleeding,
Emotions.
that you've been harmed. And so as an adult, most people never really go to therapy or never really even know how to fix all this, and they just try to go on with life. And a lot of times when someone comes in for addiction recovery or any number of addictions, what we find is that what's underlying that is childhood trauma that was never touched with a 10-foot pole, never talked about it, never healed it. And that's usually
Before we
what.
go on, I really would like to emphasize that I believe that everyone should do this work. I don't think you have to have any massive trauma. I had a really good life. I had, wonderful parents, loving parents. Yes, my dad was Marine Corps and tough in some ways that kind of trained me to be, very intuitive and, really watching my surroundings, making sure everyone is happy. But I needed to go through that, and I've told my children that they should go through it. And I've been a very loving mother. And so this is important for everyone. If you're using food, alcohol, drugs, sex, nicotine, caffeine, gambling, let's add porn, let's add, gossip. There's thousands of them.
But this is a good way to know. This is like our programming. So it's sort of like, for me as a therapist, I do a history and I find out, somebody's behavioral, what's normal for them, what's kind of their way of being. And it's like a little breadcrumb trail for what happened before. And
Yeah,
so
like a little indicator.
yeah. And so sometimes you just have a little of this. And so you probably just have had the small amount of stuff that happens to everybody, right? You're kind of normal. And then to the extent that you have real severe uses of this and you really can't function without a lot of this stuff, you can't get through the day and you can't go to a party and you can't be around people unless you have a lot of stuff on board, then that is an indication that you have more and more severe chronic, maybe more instances, or more severe, or both. And it's good for us to kind of be aware of this. Mm-hmm. So there's all kinds of diversionary tactics that we can have as an adult that some people wouldn't even say is a problem. But the controlling child is the part of us that overworks, that overperforms, that these are things that people will let you do as an adult. The addiction stuff, people will sometimes pick at you and say, you shouldn't do that. But with a lot of these things that come from the controlling child that's trying to cover up the fact that you were ever harmed, that you were ever victimized, and that you were ever vulnerable, helpless, and harmed, to the extent it's sort of like the amount of stuff hidden in your sobbing child folder is a match for how much of this you do. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
So
I mean, think of all the workaholics out there that think that they're doing it for a certain reason, or athletes that are, has to be the best in the whole world. It's often because of a parent that didn't like them unless they were perfect.
But we don't find that is a part of the original God setting. We just don't find it.
Right.
We find that was added later. That wasn't your original factory setting when you were born. You weren't born to behave like that. but it came from somewhere. So this is the controlling part of your childhood that tries to convince you that you were never harmed and everything was fine. And you just like to overwork. So see, church is on here. So you could be addicted to caretaking and volunteering and being a do-gooder. That's what I did. I was like, I was infinitely helpful in any place. I was like, I'll help you do that. I'll help you do that. I'll carry that for you. I'll give you money. Like I was, Mrs. Helpful. So how would you necessarily connect that to trauma? Because it looks like, well, that's just what a good person does, right? But
Right.
if you can't not do it and you can't breathe if you're not like constantly doing that stuff, then that is covering something else up. Okay.
Right.
And so this is kind of what it can look like. When there's certain people that have like, they're very in touch with what happened to them. And when you meet them, they will tell you every terrible thing that ever happened to them. You have certain friends that are just constantly like sort of TMI sharing. They tell you every bad thing and they tell you, everything, and they're an open book, and it's really a lot and there's all this stuff in there. But at the same time, they're very controlling and they're very bossy, and they're also like really successful and they're really hardworking and they like accomplish all kinds of stuff. And you're like, wow, how does that even exist in one person, right? And so if all you see in this person is all the terrible things that happen and all the crisis and all that, but also just tons of success, then what I would say as a therapist is that isn't you doing life out of your original child, because I can't even see who you were when you were born. Because when I'm around you, all I see is all these, you just keep telling the story about what happened and you just keep telling me all these, stuff about pain and all that. But you also are constantly talking about your accomplishments and the next big thing you're doing and the next big award that you got. But I don't ever really get to sit with just you being a person, right? Like you're not what happened to you and you're not what you do.
What
So
you
when I have
accomplished. Yeah.
so when I have somebody like this and I say, okay, I just want you to be with me, just be with me. And I don't want to hear about the bad things that have happened. And I also don't want to hear about your accomplishments. And they just go blank. They're like, what are you saying? Right. This is like instead of being a human doing, can you be a human being? Can you just be? And if you've had a lot of trauma, the answer is no. No. And so you switch between chaos and being kind of rigid and, almost like too functional, where you like to be certain and predict everything. But then you also have this other part that's like really crazy. And so do you have friends like that just kind of go back and forth and like the two extremes, really high functioning, but also just tons of chaos, and they're real emotional, and
Yes, I
they
do
have.
have a couple of those.
And sometimes we call people like this bipolar because both parts of them are just really extreme.
Intense. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's just big, and it's like that isn't anybody's original factory setting. Just so we're all clear.
God
Just
does a
all
better
clear.
job than that.
Yeah, that's not how people originally are put together. So what if somebody looks like this? So all they are is what happened to them, and their whole identity is every bad thing that happened to them. So if you start sharing your trauma story and you really were traumatized, but you never stop talking about that, and everything about you is centered and identified around that, and you're not progressing to the next step, so that your whole identity is what happened to you, and you never really develop your original self. So all those gifts that you were given at birth, they don't get the time of day, and you don't develop them and you don't grow them, and they just get missed, right? It's like the gifts that God gives you and you never open the gifts. You just let them sit there, right? So the whole world misses out on whatever God gave you as your natural
Right.
gifts. and you don't get to live your purpose because you're just playing out your pain. And then you don't have enough control over your life. And so you have this tiny little controlling child part that never really was able to kind of get up and go on with normal life. You were never able to overcome what happened to just sort of have any kind of normal experiences alongside the trauma. Does that make sense? So
Oh, yeah.
that's what this looks like. And these people really sometimes can end up as an adult that's on disability, like an adult that literally never could hold a job. They're still so broken from their trauma that they never really have any good things happen. They just can't string enough function together. So we need to help them create that other part of their personality
Right.
that helps balance that, because you need to have a part of your personality that knows when to put that stuff aside and go and live the opposite experience. And then you can deal with what happened to you, but you also need to like know how to compartmentalize and put that aside for a while so you can also have a life, right?
For sure.
So this is a whole different way that people show up. So for some people, and this is what's going to happen for the survivors when they share. So this is like what reason I want to show this is, for some people, the stuff that happened when they were a kid is deeply, deeply buried, and it isn't readily accessible. And it's so tiny compared to the part of them that's out conquering the world and strong and capable and does all this great stuff. And so what they can kind of convince themselves, and it looks true from the outside, is that whatever happened to them didn't really hurt them. Like, well, you know, some stuff happened, but like it didn't change who I am. And I don't have any I don't have any trauma, and I'm fine. And so that huge controlling child that dwarfs, look how big it is compared to your original child, and look how small the sobbing child is. So these are people that when you share anything bad that happened to you or a survivor shares, these are the people that will just come in like a hammer to shut you down, and come in with big energy to shut you down. And that is what's going on when someone just tries to change the subject, or they try to talk you out of your story, and they want to just take over, and they want to kind of get on this thing of trying to convince you and the whole world that child abuse, even if it does happen, it shouldn't be bothering you as an adult. There's just no way that you would still be harmed when you're 40 if that stuff happened when you're a child. And that is not true. And so when you see people that have also been harmed, but they're functional, see how this gets us all confused? Because we go, well, they look fine, and they're like better than most, because look how much they work, and look how many things they get done. And like, maybe if, maybe they weren't harmed, because you just logically go, yeah, how would somebody be able to do all that if they had a really neglectful and traumatic and abusive childhood? You just go, yeah, maybe that didn't happen, right? Like you just try to add the math up. But this is causing a big problem when people are trying to report the things that really happened. And I just want you to know, from all the science we have about trauma, when you're a therapist or somebody that has the training for this, we know for sure that that's possible. And there's a lot of, this is a model that kind of tries to explain it so we can all kind of get on the same page about how all this works. But this is real, and this is very, very common response, and it doesn't show us at all that there was no harm done. Because when you can't stop winning things, and you can't just come home and have dinner with your family, when you can't go on vacation, when you literally like can't have downtime, You can't rest. You know people that literally like they like, when they're off
That
work.
used to be me. I would not even if I was sick, I'd keep going.
Me too. And so that means that we are trying to keep running so that we don't feel our feelings. And those are the sobbing child feelings, which, they're not that fun, but you can learn to tolerate them, and then you don't have to like be afraid of them. And so helplessness, we can all be in a situation where we literally can't do anything about it. Helpless, hopeless, vulnerable, without help, like that can happen. So
Hmm.
we have to be able to survive those moments and just hold on as an adult. It's harder for a child,
Yeah.
but the reason that this gets set up like this is because when you are a child, it is monumentally different. It is monumentally more terrifying, because think about it. You're a kid, and you know that you can't get away from the situation. And you know that if you tell adults, they usually won't believe you. And they'll usually tell you that you must have understood that wrong. And we do that to kids. We kind of poo poo and minimize, and we kind of like,
Yep.
try to just hurry up and get them to stop crying. And we don't know how to sit with a kid when they're in pain and they're sad, and we try to rush them out of it. So we don't ever resolve all those little things that happen, small, medium, and large. And it causes the whole system of our function to be out of whack. And there's degrees. There's small, little bit out of whack, medium amount of out of whack, and extremely out of whack.
Well, and it's funny because I can just kind of imagine any therapist, probably has things happening in their life or with their kids or at their kids' school or whatever, and you're going, okay, controlling child, sobbing child. Oh, their original child.
Yeah.
It's
But
it's
this is Marilyn Murray's method, and she's like this insane rock star as a therapist. She's like, for us, she's like our rock star, and she's in her 80s right now, and she lives right here in Scottsdale, and she's like a super famous international therapist, and this is her stuff. And it's one of the better ways that I have found to try to explain trauma to people. So I just like to use it because it's kind of simple to
no, it's
understand.
so
And
good.
that's how we talk to each other, which is really funny. When me and Marilyn go out to dinner, she has a very big controlling child. She has accomplished, like, she's just insane of all the stuff she's done. You can look her up and read about her, but
Yeah.
she has a tendency when she's not paying attention to like just be a little too big. Like people that take up all the space in a room, or people that and Marilyn doesn't do that, but like this is kind of one of the things that a big controlling child does. But she likes to be the boss, and she likes everything to be done like perfect and excellent. If you got Marilyn around, whatever's happening is going to be done all the way to the nines, right?
Yeah.
Which is kind of cool. So
Yeah,
you
no,
want
it
to be,
is. I have several friends like that.
it's kind of cool, but it's like you want to be able to like not do that sometimes.
Right.
And so sometimes I have to kind of wrestle for my balanced space,
Hmm.
and we talk to each other like this, right? Like we'll say like, oh well, I feel like I can see your original child, but like, it's funny. And we have all kinds of jokes about this stuff. I sort of went through this and showed this to my kids when they were a lot younger. So in our family, we have so much fun with this stuff, and we have all kinds of jokes. But it's a way to talk about it so that you can identify when you are out of balance, or someone you're with is out of balance, and then you at least know what you're talking about and how to like move things around. And it's a pretty easy way to understand this stuff. And so
It's good.
what Marilyn says is the goal is to be a healthy, balanced person. So the goal in the healing journey of recovery is to be integrated. So an integrated person is, you're not afraid to pull forward into your consciousness and kind of integrate it into your story. with people that have earned the right to hear it, the intimate people in your life,
Right.
is you can sit with what happened to you. You don't relive it when you talk about it. So that's why, like, Jessie doesn't cry and fall apart every time she tells her story. I don't either. You don't. Madison doesn't. When you've healed, you can talk about what happened without re-feeling the feelings that you felt when it was happening. So that's another
Right.
misunderstanding that people don't understand with trauma, is if that really happened, then every time you talk about it, you'll fall apart. Well, no, that's not how
Yeah.
that works. And you
Yeah.
don't want to let someone do that, because they're making their trauma worse. If you let somebody do that, they're re-traumatizing themselves. So we're not supposed to let people do that. Our friends or family, or, even if you're not a client, you're not supposed to let your friends do that, right? And so a
Exactly.
healthy balanced person remembers rationally and logically what happened and takes responsibility for it. So you don't stay in that victim mode, and you don't kind of keep uh, sharing the story from a place of victimhood, and
Right.
you don't keep talking about the person that did it for 30 years. That means you haven't progressed. And
Right.
so you put it in perspective, you have deep feelings about it, but you also don't lose your ability to be rational and logical and understand why it happened. So you have this balance of rational, logical, and deeply feeling. And a balanced, healthy person is a combination of your original child, because we have to let that grow up. We want that to see the light of day. We want that to be what grows into your adult self. That is what God wanted to be birthed into the earth. God gives everybody the certain mix of healthy traits, and the strengths
Right.
and the weaknesses. And your weaknesses are also a part of how you're put together on purpose, because you have to be balanced. You have to have some things that you're not good at, and you have to have
Right.
some things that you let other people help you with, because that's God's design. So you're supposed to have both sides of it, and not worry about it, right? And so, but you're not supposed to grow up your sobbing child, because no one wants to be around that. Speaking for myself, it
Yeah, we
wears
don't
people
want a
out.
mature version of that.
No, it's like that's not healthy, and it's also not how God designed you.
Well, and
And
it
that
also
will
will make people like not want to be around you,
yes,
and
it's
you don't
just different.
benefit in the long run. Yeah.
Oh, because whatever you do to help them, they're the same person the next time you see them, and they never take your advice, and they never get better, and it's like it's a nightmare. And the controlling child is kind of hard to be around too, because if they're just always like on fire, and they're always just like performing and doing, it's just kind of hard to sort of like be at an even playing field with them, right? Because it's just it's too high octane and not enough balance, right?
Hmm.
And so this is the goal for all of us. To be a healthy balanced person, the original child is supposed to be bigger than the sobbing child or the controlling child, but you're not supposed to get rid of your sobbing child, and you're not supposed to get rid of the controlling child. You need both of them.
Right.
When you can really sit with what happened that hurt your feelings, what really was scary, what made you sad and was really harmful, it gives you empathy and compassion as an adult. For when someone else shares, you can have empathy and compassion. That's because you can connect with how you were harmed. So you can hear someone share about their harm, and you just stay like this. But
Right.
when you can't deal with that, you shut somebody down pretty quick. Because what happens to survivors is when people cannot tolerate the fact that they've ever been vulnerable, they
Hmm.
want you to shut up, because they don't want to accidentally start feeling. So people that are very over focused in their controlling child, they do not like to feel negative feelings. They'll
I could
really.
imagine probably everyone on this call has like got people running through their heads right now, and they're like, "Oh, that's why they do that." That's
But
good.
that
And
is
then
loving too.
I've got about 15 more minutes. So if we could maybe go through these last 10
Yeah.
pretty quick.
Yeah. So that's it. And we can just stop here.
Oh, okay. That was it?
We
I
can just
thought there were
stop here.
27 of them. Sorry.
There are, but for today, for what we're sharing here is there's more we could go into, but I think this just gives a basic baseline for today is for us to really be a healthy community where we all help each other and some share and some hear and we're all kind of in this together.
Yep.
You want to be activated and you want to cultivate and water and fertilize your original self. Who were you when you were a little 5-year-old? 5-year-old is kind of a good reference point to try to remember, like, what did you care about? How did you, what did you like to do? And as adults, we have to remember to be playful and take time to play and learn new things and really have some good recreation time. And that's not wrong to do that. And so creativity, your sexuality is a part of your original child. For you to kind of physically have your equipment work, like where you're, you can think and feel, but like literally you don't have parts of your brain that don't work. And so that you don't have a lot of chronic illnesses that keep you from, doing things and participating in life. And so your original child is the thing that the world is supposed to have, that God wanted to, cultivate.
Mm-hmm.
And he doesn't want to cultivate the harm that other people did to you. We have to address it. We have to speak it. We have to acknowledge it's a part of the human story. It's a part of the collective human story. It's a part of our individual stories, and everyone has a different amount, but everybody has an amount. And we have to let it be okay, by example, that people share whatever it is that is their story, whether it's small, medium, and large. We have to make room for that, or we can't all be healthy together. And it's okay to have empathy when someone shares, but don't try to wear their experience and don't try to like imagine what it was like for them. And don't try to pretend that it happened to you.
There's
Right?
people that do that. That's what
Yeah.
Cheryl was saying. That
Yeah.
wow.
And that's where you are doing it wrong. You don't need to imagine that happened to you to understand what happened to them. That's doing it
Or your
wrong.
children, or don't imagine it happening to anybody.
No, and that's codependent too. It's like you stay in your own lane and you listen to them share, and all you can do is have a sense because it didn't happen to you. So you'll
Right.
never really know. Only they know. It's their experience. They're the authority. Don't talk them in or out of any part of it. That's why we're supposed to not try to nitpick somebody's story. You weren't there. You don't know. They
Good.
know. Listen, and then leave it alone. And don't try to change it, pick it apart, make it worse than it is. But it's like it belongs to them. You on the outside just have empathy and compassion, and then you can share some of yours too, but don't compare and don't like tweak each other and all that. It's a standalone thing. And then your controlling child, it helps you to keep these all in the right balance. So you don't get mad at yourself when you try to like have some boundaries and when
Mm-hmm.
you try to control a conversation. It's okay to do some of that because it might be unsafe for your original child and your sobbing child. There might be like something going on that is something that you already have experienced as unhealthy, and then those feelings come up and you go, can we like change the subject, or can we like, talk about this in a different way? And it's okay to do that. And it helps you be responsible, and it's part of our defense mechanism. So if we're sharing something that someone else just in that moment, they need to change the subject, we just can be okay with that. Let them do that.
Yeah.
And
One of the
we
things
all,
though that like I would like to say is like when you do find yourself doing that, if you're an adult person and you're just having a chat with your friend and you find yourself wanting to shut down a conversation. Now, of course, there's some people that are very nosy or whatever, and they need to be careful. But don't you think it's an indicator that they probably need some work to do? Like they probably have some controlling child work to do?
that is what it means. And that's why I wanted to show everybody this little visual so we can all kind of have this common understanding, because that's exactly what's happening. And then at least you know what it is and you don't go down these little rabbit holes because it's too much. So somebody that's too bossy, too controlling, they know what's right. They know they're the authority on whatever is, that's not balanced. That just doesn't have balance. And a lot of times it's because they are trying to avoid feeling. And again, a little bit of that, we go in and out. We're normal, we're trying our best. But if somebody is almost always stuck in just one of these other positions, then you're not going to really have that person as part of your inner circle, and you're not going to want to share anything too deep, because if they have a tiny sobbing child, they can't handle it. They can't even feel their own feelings and they don't want to. And you have to respect that.
Yeah.
They're not in a place for that to go well. But if you also are around somebody that has a really obnoxious, controlling child, you're just spitting into the wind. And they'll try to talk you out of knowing what you know, and they'll bully you. And it's sometimes they're doing that to protect themselves, which that's what it is. But now you can see what I'm talking about when I say that.
Why? Yeah, so good.
But,
And there's so many takeaways from this. Like, I think it's really valuable as a community because we we are a community. There's the same people that I interact with on, the channel, as Twitter, as people that I'm, working on getting in the show or whatever. But then there's also the same people that show up and support, and they're strong, and they're answering questions in the chat for people, like you have so many times. But just to have this ability to look at the community and say, we want to have a way of communicating that is really effective and powerful and respectful, and that we're allowing people to be who they are. We're also aware of when something might have gone over a boundary now and that we didn't know before because we weren't educated. You don't know what you don't know. And then too, there's sometimes people don't have access to you or Jesse or Madison or, whoever. And these people are just doing the best they can with their friend down the street. It's good to know that safety is the first thing, stability is the next thing, and that we can slowly get to a place as a community to be stronger and stronger for each other, which, I can't thank you enough, because there's nothing more important than all of us maturing from our original design.
And it's better to just go slow and just be mindful than to rush and be reckless.
It's good.
And then the last thing is this is Marilyn Murray's book. Oh, so it's called The Murray Method. And you can get it on Amazon. And it goes into a lot more detail of everything that I talked about, but it's also a trauma workbook. If you want to work through the trauma yourself without a therapist, this book takes you right through all the steps of how to do it, and it has exercises. And then the other one I recommend, of course, is Kathy O'Brien's PTSD book.
Love that book.
Either one of those or both, and they say a lot of the same stuff, but those are the two things that I would recommend anybody that if you were triggered by anything or anything came up and you're not sure how to get, your stability going, those two books are wonderful, wonderful resources. And then for anything that we shared today, if maybe the community and everybody that was, listens to this, if people will just let you know which little things that they might want to expand on, and then we could do another one. And I could kind of, the other ones were just a little more detail. And the other thing that I think could be helpful on this topic is, but it would just take too long to do it now, is the circles of intimacy and how you decide who goes in what circle.
Yeah.
That's also Marilyn Murray's work. And I don't know what I would do without it, because it's just, she did a similar structure to have it be easy to understand. And then it wouldn't take us that long to go through that. But that would also give all of us a common way to stay coherent as a group.
Yeah, no, I love that. And we still have to do the one with you and Madison where you explain the triangle, because I don't
Yeah.
want to forget that we promised people that. So Madison's coming back on the 17th on my birthday. So maybe you
Oh,
can join us and we'll do that.
yeah, just let me know.
Okay. Thanks everybody for coming tonight. Terrina, where do people get a hold of you if they need you?
Just TerinaPicarello.com, my website. I don't do a whole lot of stuff for a lot of these reasons.
Yeah.
And so,
Make it
yeah,
safe for all of your clientele.
yeah, yeah.
Very good. All right. Well, everybody go have a safe and beautiful weekend and be nice and tolerant, because we don't know if we've got sobbing children in front of us or controlling children in front of us. And let's go out and try to nurture the original child within
Yep.
everyone.
That's
Thanks,
it.
Terrina.
Thank you,
Good night,
Carmen.
everybody.